The lone figure of Asher O'Malley appeared on the horizon like a mirage, his silhouette stark against the burning orange sunset, as he returned to what remained of his family ranch outside Wilson, Colorado territory in the spring of 1875. The devastating wildfire that had swept through the region 3 months prior had left his fences charred and cattle scattered to the winds, much like his faith in the Almighty. Asher removed his weathered Stetson, revealing sandy brown hair and a face too young for the weight it carried. At 28, he'd already buried his parents, lost most of his herd, and was now staring at the blackened remains of the fence line that had once marked the proud boundaries of the O'Malley Ranch. His father had built that fence with his own 2 hands nearly 30 years ago when he'd first staked his claim in this wild country. "Gonna have to start from scratch," Asher muttered to his horse, Copper, as he dismounted. The animal snorted in agreement, tossing his chestnut mane as if to say he understood the enormity of the task ahead. Asher patted the horse's flank. "Don't you worry. We'll rebuild. We always do." But even as the words left his lips, doubt crept into his heart. The fire had taken almost everything: the barn, most of the corrals, and worst of all, over half his cattle. The modest homestead house had been spared, but what good was a home without a livelihood? Asher led Copper to the water trough, one of the few structures still standing, and watched as the horse drank deeply. The setting sun cast long shadows across the land, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. In that light, Asher could almost pretend nothing had changed, that his father might walk out of the house at any moment, pipe in hand, ready to discuss the day's work. But James O'Malley had been gone for 2 years now, followed 6 months later by Asher's mother, Sarah. Their passing had left him alone with a ranch too big for one man and a heart too heavy with grief. "Lord, if you're listening," Asher whispered, his voice rough with emotion, "I could use a sign that all this struggle means something." His prayer drifted away on the evening breeze, unanswered like so many before it. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of day that made the mountains to the west seem close enough to touch. Asher rose before the sun, as was his habit, and set about assessing the work ahead. The fence would be his first priority. Without it, he couldn't hope to recover and contain what remained of his herd. He spent the morning gathering what tools had survived the fire and salvaging usable lumber from the ruins of the barn. By midday, sweat soaked his shirt, and his hands were raw from the work. But he'd managed to clear a stretch of the old fence line and set several new posts. The sound of an approaching wagon pulled him from his labor. Squinting against the sun, Asher watched as a covered wagon made its way down the rutted dirt road toward his ranch. Visitors were rare out here, 5 miles from Wilson. The wagon drew closer, and Asher could make out a woman at the reins, her face shaded by a wide-brimmed bonnet. Beside her sat an older man, his white beard visible even at this distance. "Hello there," the woman called as the wagon came to a stop near where Asher worked. Her voice carried across the open space, clear and confident. Asher straightened, pushing his hat back on his head. "Afternoon," he replied, approaching the wagon. "Can I help you folks?" The woman smiled, and Asher was struck by the warmth in her eyes, the color of summer honey. "I believe we might be the ones to help you, Mr. O'Malley." She set the brake on the wagon and gracefully climbed down, her movements sure despite the long skirt she wore. "I'm Beatrice Novak, and this is my father, Henry." The older man nodded but remained seated, his rheumy eyes taking in the charred landscape. "Looks like you've had your share of troubles, son." Asher glanced around at the devastation, suddenly seeing it through strangers' eyes. "Fire came through in February. Been trying to get back on my feet since." Beatrice removed her bonnet, revealing a cascade of auburn hair neatly pinned at the nape of her neck. "We heard about your situation in town. Father and I just moved to Wilson to take over the mercantile from my Uncle Richard. He's not well." "Novak's Goods?" Asher asked, recalling the general store in town. "The very same," Henry confirmed. "Richard's my brother. When his health started failing, he asked if we'd come west from Pennsylvania to help. Beatrice runs the store now, and I mostly stay out of her way." He chuckled, his weathered face creasing with affection as he looked at his daughter. Beatrice rolled her eyes good-naturedly. Father exaggerates. He's been invaluable with the bookkeeping. She turned her attention back to Asher. Mr. O'Malley, we've brought some supplies for you. Nothing fancy, just some provisions, fencing tools, and seeds for planting. The community in Wilson wants to help. Asher stared at her, momentarily speechless. Pride warred with gratitude in his chest. That's mighty kind, but I can't accept charity. Times are hard for everyone. It's not charity, Beatrice countered, her chin lifting slightly. It's neighbors helping neighbors. Isn't that what makes the West survivable? Besides, you can pay it back when your ranch is thriving again. Henry nodded sagely. Listen to her, son. She's got more sense than most men twice her age. Asher looked from father to daughter. Then at the wagon loaded with supplies that would save him weeks of work and precious dollars. His resistance crumbled. I'm obliged to you both, and to the folks in town. I'll make it right when I can. Beatrice smiled again, and something flickered in Asher's chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a very long time. We know you will. Now, shall we unload these supplies? Father and I can stay to help for a while if you'd like. And so began a day unlike any Asher had known since before the fire. With Henry supervising from a chair in the shade and Beatrice working alongside him with surprising strength and skill, they unloaded the wagon and organized the supplies. She wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty, Asher noticed, and she worked with an efficiency that matched his own. By late afternoon, they had accomplished more than Asher would have managed in 3 days alone. Henry had dozed off in his chair, and Asher and Beatrice sat on the porch steps sharing a canteen of water. You're not what I expected, Miss Novak, Asher admitted, stealing a glance at her profile. The afternoon sun caught in her hair, turning it to burnished copper. Oh? And what did you expect? There was amusement in her voice. I'm not rightly sure, but not someone who could drive a fence post or handle a hammer like you do. Beatrice laughed, the sound like music in the quiet afternoon. I grew up helping my brothers on our farm in Pennsylvania. When Mother died, I took over running the household. Father never treated me like I was made of porcelain, so I never learned to be fragile. Asher nodded, understanding in his eyes. My ma was the same way. Toughest woman I ever knew. She could outwork most men and never complained, even when times were lean. She sounds wonderful. She was. Asher looked out over the land, his expression distant. Would have liked to see this place flourish like Pa always dreamed. Beatrice followed his gaze. It will flourish again, Mr. O'Malley. I can feel it. As the sun began its descent, Henry stirred from his nap, and Beatrice announced it was time for them to return to town. Asher helped them pack up the wagon, his hands lingering near Beatrice's as they worked. Will you come to town for supplies soon? She asked as she climbed up to the wagon seat. I reckon I might now that I've got a fence to build and cattle to find, Asher replied, surprised by how much he looked forward to seeing her again. Good. The mercantile is open every day but Sunday. She gathered the reins, then paused. We hold a small service in the back room on Sundays, if you're interested. Nothing formal, just neighbors gathering to read scripture and sing a hymn or two. Asher's expression closed slightly. Been a while since I've done much praying, Miss Novak. Something in her eyes softened. The invitation stands regardless. God's patient that way. As he watched them drive away, Asher realized that for the first time in months, he felt something akin to hope stirring in his heart. The next day, Asher rose with new determination. The supplies from town had given him a fighting chance, and he wasn't about to waste it. He worked from dawn until dusk, setting fence posts along the eastern boundary of his property, where most of his remaining cattle had been spotted by neighboring ranchers. 3 days later, with a good stretch of fence taking shape, Asher decided it was time to visit Wilson. He needed more supplies, and truth be told, the prospect of seeing Beatrice again pulled at him like a lodestone. Wilson was a modest settlement, just large enough to boast a main street with a handful of businesses, the mercantile, a saloon, a small hotel, the sheriff's office, and a barber shop that doubled as a dentist's practice when needed. What it lacked in size, it made up for in character, with buildings painted in faded colors and hitching posts worn smooth from years of use. Novak's Goods stood in the middle of the street, its freshly painted sign a stark contrast to the weathered storefronts around it. Asher tied copper to the hitching post and paused a moment to straighten his shirt and dust off his pants before entering. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, and the familiar scents of leather, coffee, and tobacco greeted him. The store was busy with midday customers, women examining bolts of fabric and men discussing the latest shipment of tools. And there was Beatrice, moving efficiently behind the counter, weighing flour for Mrs. Peterson, the banker's wife. She looked up at the sound of the bell, and her face brightened when she saw Asher. "Mr. O'Malley, what a pleasant surprise." She finished with Mrs. Peterson and made her way over to him. Today, she wore a simple blue dress that matched her eyes, her hair pinned up in a practical style that somehow enhanced her natural beauty. "Miss Novak," Asher removed his hat, suddenly conscious of his work-roughened appearance. "I've come for some supplies." "Of course." She gestured to the store around them. "What do you need?" They moved through the store together, Asher selecting items for his fence-building project and Beatrice offering suggestions and occasionally pointing out new inventory. Her knowledge of tools and ranching needs impressed him further. "How's the fence coming along?" she asked as she wrapped his purchases in brown paper. "Making progress. Got about a quarter of the eastern boundary done. Figure I'll focus there first, get the strays rounded up before I tackle the rest." "Sounds sensible." Beatrice tied the package with twine. "And how many cattle do you think you'll recover?" "If I'm lucky, maybe 30 head. Had close to 100 before the fire." The admission stung, but Asher found he could speak of it more easily to her than to anyone else. Beatrice's eyes held sympathy without pity. 30 is a start. You can build from there." As she tallied his purchases, the door opened again, and Sheriff Tom Landry entered. He nodded to various townspeople before approaching the counter. "Miss Novak, O'Malley." He tipped his hat to them both. "Just the man I was hoping to find. Got word from the Jennings place that they've spotted some of your cattle on their north pasture. Thought you might want to know." "I appreciate that, Sheriff. I'll head that way tomorrow." Landry nodded, then turned to Beatrice. "Got that order of coffee beans in yet? The wife's been hounding me about it." As Beatrice helped the sheriff, Asher found himself studying her, the graceful way she moved, the kindness in her interactions, the quiet competence she displayed. Something about her drew him in a way he hadn't experienced since courting his childhood sweetheart, Mary, who had chosen to marry a banker from Denver instead of a struggling rancher. Once the sheriff had left, Beatrice returned her attention to Asher. "Will you stay for supper? Father and I eat at the hotel restaurant most nights. The cooking's not fancy, but it's better than my attempts." Asher hesitated. He hadn't socialized much since his parents' passing, preferring the solitude of his ranch. But the thought of spending more time with Beatrice was too tempting to resist. "I'd be honored, Miss Novak, if you're sure I won't be imposing." "Not at all. Father enjoys company, and so do I." She glanced at the clock on the wall. "I close up in an hour. Meet us at the hotel at 6? Asher agreed, collected his purchases, and stepped back onto the street, his heart lighter than it had been in months. That evening, dinner with Beatrice and Henry proved to be the most enjoyable meal Asher had experienced in years. Henry regaled him with stories of Pennsylvania and his brother Richard's early days in Colorado, while Beatrice occasionally interjected with witty comments that had both men laughing. "Did Richard tell you about the time he accidentally sold Mrs. Williams a fishing rod instead of a broom?" Henry asked, wiping tears of mirth from his eyes. "The poor woman didn't realize until she got home." Beatrice shook her head, smiling. "Uncle Richard's eyesight was failing even then, but he was too proud to admit it. Mrs. Williams was very understanding, though. She kept the rod and learned to fish." As the evening progressed, Asher found himself opening up about his own life, his parents' journey west when he was just a boy, his father's dream of building a cattle empire, and his mother's steadfast support through all the hardships they faced. "They sound like remarkable people," Beatrice said softly when he finished speaking. "You must miss them terribly." "Every day," Asher admitted, "but especially since the fire. Pa would know exactly how to rebuild, where to find the strays, how to make it all work again." Henry, who had been quietly listening, leaned forward. "Son, from what you've told us, your father built that ranch from nothing. You've got his blood in your veins. You'll find your way." Asher nodded, grateful for the old man's confidence. As the evening came to a close, he found himself reluctant to leave their company. At the hotel entrance, he thanked them both for their hospitality. "Will we see you Sunday?" Beatrice asked, her expression hopeful. "For the service?" Asher hesitated. Once, faith had been as natural to him as breathing, but since losing his parents and facing the devastation of the fire, he'd found it harder to believe in a benevolent God. "I'm not sure, Miss Novak. I've got a lot of work to do." Something like disappointment flickered across her face, but she quickly masked it with a smile. "The invitation remains open, Mr. O'Malley. Always." As he rode back to his ranch that night, the stars a canopy overhead, Asher thought about Beatrice's invitation and the quiet faith she seemed to carry. It had been so long since he'd set foot in a church or opened his father's old Bible. Yet something about Beatrice's gentle persistence made him wonder if perhaps he'd been too quick to turn his back on the faith of his childhood. The next morning, Asher rode out to the Jennings ranch to check on the cattle sheriff Landry had mentioned. Frank Jennings, a gruff man in his 50s with a reputation for fair dealing, met him at the property line. "They're in the north pasture," Frank said, after greetings were exchanged. "Look to be about a dozen of your shorthorns, including that big bull you were so proud of." Asher's heart leaped. The bull, Thunder, was his prize breeding stock, worth more than any 3 of his other cattle combined. "Frank, that's the best news I've had in months." The older rancher nodded, his weather-beaten face cracking into a rare smile. "Figured you'd be pleased. They're a bit skittish after the fire, but they've been grazing well. You want to move them today?" By mid-afternoon, Asher had successfully herded his recovered cattle back to his property, driving them through a gap in the fence that he promptly closed behind them. The sight of Thunder leading the small herd into the familiar pasture brought a lump to his throat. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered, surprising himself with the prayer. Perhaps some part of him still believed after all. Over the next 2 weeks, Asher fell into a rhythm. He worked on the fence from dawn until mid-afternoon, then rode out to search for more of his scattered herd. He was gradually having success, recovering cattle in 1s and 2s, sometimes guided by reports from neighboring ranchers. Each recovery strengthened his determination to rebuild. Every few days, he made the trip into Wilson for supplies, timing his visits to coincide with the slower periods at the mercantile so he could spend a few minutes in conversation with Beatrice. She always greeted him warmly, asking about his progress and offering encouragement. During one such visit, as Beatrice was wrapping a new coil of wire for him, she mentioned that the town was planning a spring social the following Saturday. "It's nothing elaborate," she explained, "just a community gathering with food, music, and dancing. Father thinks it would do you good to attend." "Does he now?" Asher raised an eyebrow, amusement tugging at his lips. "And what do you think, Miss Novak?" A hint of color rose in her cheeks. "I think a man needs more than work to sustain him, Mr. O'Malley, even in these challenging times." He studied her for a moment, taking in the hopeful expression in her eyes. "I suppose I could spare an evening away from the ranch." Her smile was worth the commitment. "Wonderful. It starts at sunset in the town square. There will be lanterns and a fiddler from up near Boulder." As Asher left the store, he realized he was looking forward to the social, with an eagerness that had nothing to do with music or food and everything to do with the prospect of spending an evening in Beatrice's company. The Saturday of the social arrived clear and mild, a perfect spring evening. Asher spent the morning working on the fence as usual, but by midday, he found himself thinking about the night ahead. It had been so long since he'd attended a social event that he felt almost like a boy again, nervous and anticipatory. He bathed thoroughly in the creek that ran through his property, shaved with extra care, and put on his one good shirt and the suit coat that had belonged to his father. Looking in the small mirror above his washstand, he barely recognized the man staring back at him, cleaned up and almost handsome, if a bit gaunt from the hardships of recent months. The town square was transformed when he arrived, just as the sun was setting. Lanterns hung from ropes strung between buildings, casting a warm, golden glow over everything. Tables laden with food lined one side of the square, and a small platform had been set up for the musicians, not just a fiddler, as Beatrice had mentioned, but also a man with a banjo and another with a harmonica. People from all around the area had gathered, dressed in their finest clothes, talking and laughing as children darted between groups playing impromptu games of tag. Asher felt a pang of something like homesickness, remembering similar gatherings from his childhood, when his parents would dance together while he watched in awe of their happiness. He spotted Henry first, seated in a chair near the musicians, tapping his foot to the lively tune they were playing. Asher made his way over, greeting several townspeople as he passed. "Evening, Henry," he said, taking a seat beside the older man. "Quite a gathering." Henry's face lit up. "Asher, my boy, good to see you out and about. Yes, Wilson may be small, but we know how to celebrate the coming of spring." He glanced around. "Beatrice will be pleased you came. She's over by the food tables, helping Mrs. Landry arrange the pies." Asher followed Henry's gaze and felt his breath catch. Beatrice stood in the lantern light, wearing a dress of deep green that complemented her auburn hair, which for once was styled in loose curls around her shoulders rather than in its usual practical arrangement. She was laughing at something Mrs. Landry had said, her face animated and radiant. As if sensing his attention, she looked up, their eyes meeting across the square. Her smile widened, and she excused herself from Mrs. Landry to make her way toward them. "Mr. O'Malley," she greeted him, her voice warm. "I'm so glad you could come." "Wouldn't have missed it, Miss Novak," he replied, suddenly very aware of the rapid beating of his heart. "Your father was just telling me that Wilson knows how to welcome spring." "Indeed we do. Have you eaten? The ladies of the town have outdone themselves this year." Before Asher could respond, the music changed to a waltz, and couples began moving to the center of the square to dance. Henry chuckled. "Beatrice, why don't you show our friend here how we dance in Wilson? I'm afraid these old bones of mine aren't much for waltzing anymore." Beatrice's cheeks flushed slightly, but she turned to Asher with a questioning look. "Would you care to dance, Mr. O'Malley?" For a moment, Asher hesitated. It had been years since he'd danced, and the thought of holding Beatrice in his arms, even in the formal frame of a waltz, sent a rush of emotions through him. "I'd be honored, Miss Novak. Though I should warn you I'm out of practice." "I'll lead then," she teased, offering her hand. Taking it, Asher followed her to the makeshift dance floor. As they faced each other, he placed his right hand gently at her waist, feeling the warmth of her through the fabric of her dress. She rested her left hand on his shoulder, and their free hands clasped. The music washed over them as they began to move, and Asher found that his body remembered the steps better than he'd expected. Beatrice was light on her feet, following his lead easily, and soon they were gliding among the other couples as if they'd danced together 100 times before. "You lied, Mr. O'Malley," Beatrice said softly as they turned. "You dance quite well for a man who claims to be out of practice." "My mother insisted I learn properly," he admitted. "Said no son of hers would stomp around like a clumsy bull." Beatrice laughed, the sound melding with the music. "Wise woman, your mother." As they continued to dance, Asher became increasingly aware of the delicate floral scent of her perfume, the way her hand felt in his, the graceful curve of her neck where a tendril of hair had escaped its pins. For the first time since the fire, perhaps since his parents' deaths, he felt fully present in the moment, not dwelling on the past or worrying about the future. The waltz ended too soon, and couples around them began to separate. But Asher found himself reluctant to let go of Beatrice's hand. She seemed equally hesitant, her eyes meeting his with a question he couldn't quite decipher. "Would you like some refreshment?" he asked, finally breaking the spell between them. "I'm parched from all this dancing." She nodded, and they made their way to the punch bowl, where Henry had joined a group of the town's older residents. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of conversation, more dancing, and shared laughter. Asher found himself drawn into the community in a way he hadn't experienced since returning to the ranch after his travels as a young man. Near the end of the evening, as the musicians took a break and people gathered in small groups to chat, Beatrice suggested a walk around the square. Away from the noise of the gathering, they strolled in comfortable silence for a few minutes. "Thank you for coming tonight," Beatrice finally said, her voice soft in the darkness. "I know social gatherings aren't easy when you're carrying so much." Asher glanced at her, surprised by her perceptiveness. "No, they're not, but I'm glad I came." He paused, then added honestly, "Being with you makes the weight lighter somehow." In the dim light of a distant lantern, he saw her cheeks color. "That's a lovely thing to say." "It's the truth." Asher stopped walking, turning to face her. "Miss Novak, Beatrice, I want you to know how much I appreciate everything you've done for me. Not just the supplies or the help with the fence, but the hope you've given me. I was in a dark place before you and Henry drove up to my ranch that day." Beatrice's expression softened. "I believe God puts people in our paths when we need them most, Mr. O'Malley." "Asher," he corrected gently. "Please call me Asher." "Asher," she repeated, his name sounding like music on her lips. "I believe that the fire, terrible as it was, may have been clearing the way for new growth in your life. Sometimes we need to lose everything to find what truly matters." Her words struck a chord deep within him. "You sound like my mother. She always said God had a purpose in every trial." "Do you believe that?" Beatrice asked, her eyes searching his face. Asher took a deep breath. "I used to. Since the fire, since losing my parents, I've struggled to see any purpose in the suffering. But lately I've been wondering if maybe the purpose was to lead me to this moment. To you." The admission hung between them, more revealing than he'd intended. But Beatrice didn't pull away. Instead, she reached out and gently touched his hand. "Perhaps it was," she said softly. "Faith is a journey, Asher. It has its valleys and mountains. I think what matters is that we keep walking, even when the path is obscured." In that moment, looking into her earnest face, Asher felt something within him shift, a small but significant realignment, like a key turning in a lock long rusted shut. It wasn't a complete return to faith, but it was a willingness to consider that perhaps God hadn't abandoned him after all. "Would you join me for the service tomorrow?" he asked impulsively. "I think I'm ready to try again." Beatrice's smile illuminated the darkness. "I would be honored." The next morning, Asher rose early as usual, but instead of immediately setting to work, he retrieved his father's Bible from the trunk where it had lain untouched for months. The leather was worn smooth from years of handling, the pages marked with notes in his father's careful handwriting. He ran his fingers over the embossed cover. Remembering how his father had read from this book every evening, his deep voice bringing the ancient words to life. Opening it at random, Asher's eyes fell on a passage from Isaiah. "But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint." His father had underlined the verse and written in the margin, "Remember this in the hard times, son. God's timing, not ours." Asher closed the Bible, a lump forming in his throat. Perhaps his father's wisdom still had something to teach him, even now. Later that morning, dressed in his Sunday best, Asher made the ride into Wilson. The service was held in the back room of the Mercantile, as Beatrice had mentioned. When he arrived, about 20 people were already gathered, sitting on benches arranged in rows facing a small podium. Beatrice, wearing a simple blue dress with a lace collar, stood near the entrance, greeting people as they arrived. Her face lit up when she saw him, and she quickly moved to his side. "You came," she said, her voice warm with pleasure. I said I would, Asher replied, suddenly shy. Is it all right if I sit with you and Henry? Of course. She led him to a bench near the front where Henry was already seated, his Bible open on his lap. The old man looked up in surprise, then smiled broadly. Well, well, good to see you, son. As Asher took his seat beside Beatrice, he felt a mix of emotions, anxiety, hope, and a strange sense of homecoming. It had been so long since he'd participated in worship that he'd almost forgotten the rhythm of it. But as the service began, led by a traveling preacher who visited Wilson once a month, the familiar cadences of prayer and scripture reading washed over him like a gentle rain, softening the hardened places in his heart. The preacher, a tall man with kind eyes and a resonant voice, spoke about rebuilding not just structures, but faith and community. His text was from Nehemiah, about the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls. As he described how the people worked together, each family responsible for a section of the wall nearest their home, Asher couldn't help but think of his own fence-building efforts and how the community of Wilson had rallied to help him. The beauty of rebuilding, the preacher said, is that it forces us to reconsider the foundation. When God allows destruction in our lives, it is often to clear away what was built on sand, so that we might rebuild on solid rock. Beside him, Beatrice nodded slightly, her profile serene in the morning light filtering through the windows. Asher found himself watching her as much as listening to the sermon, struck by the quiet strength she embodied. After the service, as people mingled and shared news, Beatrice introduced Asher to those he hadn't yet met, including several families who lived on the outskirts of town. Many expressed their sympathy about the fire and offered assistance with his rebuilding efforts. You see, Beatrice said quietly as they stepped outside into the spring sunshine, you're not alone in this, Asher. There are people who want to help. I'm beginning to see that, he admitted. Looking at her upturned face, he was struck by a sudden, overwhelming urge to kiss her. Instead, he asked, Would you and Henry join me for dinner at the ranch next Sunday? It's not much to look at right now, but I'd like to show you the progress I've made. Beatrice's eyes widened slightly. Then she smiled. We would be delighted. The week that followed was one of the most productive since Asher had begun his rebuilding efforts. With renewed energy and purpose, he extended the fence line significantly, enclosing a large section of his eastern pasture. 3 more of his cattle were found and brought back, including a cow with a young calf at her side, new life amidst the recovery. He also spent evenings cleaning and repairing the homestead house, which had been largely neglected since the fire. It was a solid structure, built by his father with logs from the nearby forest, but it needed attention. A leaking roof patch, broken window panes, and a general layer of dust and disuse. By Saturday, the house was presentable, if simple. Asher even picked wildflowers from the meadow and placed them in his mother's old vase on the kitchen table. Looking around at his handiwork, he felt a surge of pride. The home was beginning to feel like his own again, not just a relic of his parents' lives. Sunday dawned clear and warm, a perfect spring day. Asher attended the service in town, where the local schoolteacher led in the preacher's absence, then helped Beatrice and Henry into their wagon for the trip to his ranch. As they traveled, Henry regaled them with stories of his youth in Pennsylvania, making both Asher and Beatrice laugh with his colorful descriptions of mishaps and adventures. When they arrived at the ranch, Asher felt a moment of anxiety as he saw it through their eyes still showing the scars of the fire, the rebuilding only partially complete. But Beatrice's expression as she surveyed the property was one of appreciation, not pity. It's beautiful here, she said, taking in the sweeping vista of grassland backed by distant mountains. I can see why your father chose this land. Pride swelled in Asher's chest. He always said it was the prettiest piece of Colorado he'd ever seen. Come, let me show you what I've done with the fence. He helped them down from the wagon and led them on a tour of the property, pointing out the new fence line and the area where his recovered cattle now grazed. Henry nodded approvingly at the solid construction of the fence posts and the tight stringing of the wire. "Good work, son. This'll hold any cattle that try to test it." Beatrice walked alongside Asher, asking thoughtful questions about his plans for expanding the herd and repairing the barn. Her genuine interest touched him deeply. "And here," Asher said, gesturing to a cleared area near where the old barn had stood, "is where I'm planning to build the new barn. Smaller than the original, but more efficiently designed." "When will you start construction?" Henry asked, leaning on his walking stick. "Once the fence is complete. I figure another month or so, depending on how many more strays I find and how the spring grass comes in." They made their way back to the house, where Asher had prepared a simple but hearty meal venison stew, fresh biscuits, and apple pie purchased from the hotel restaurant in town. He'd set the table with his mother's good dishes, saved from the china cabinet that had miraculously survived the fire. As they ate, conversation flowed easily among the three of them. Asher found himself sharing stories of his childhood on the ranch that he hadn't recalled in years, the time he'd tried to ride one of his father's bulls and ended up with a broken arm, the Christmas when his mother had managed to hide a puppy in the barn until the moment came to surprise him. "You were blessed with loving parents," Beatrice observed, her eyes soft. "I was," Asher agreed. "I didn't always appreciate it at the time, especially during my rebellious years. But they never gave up on me." "Just as God never gives up on us," Henry added, his weathered face thoughtful. "Even when we turn away from him." Asher nodded, acknowledging the truth in the old man's words. "I'm beginning to understand that better now." After the meal, while Henry dozed in a chair on the porch, Asher invited Beatrice to walk with him to the creek that ran through the southern edge of his property. It was a peaceful spot, shaded by cottonwood trees that had escaped the fire's path. "This was my thinking place as a boy," Asher explained as they reached the creek bank. "I'd come here when I was troubled or needed to make a decision." Beatrice smiled, seating herself on a large flat rock at the water's edge. "It's lovely. Peaceful." Asher sat beside her, watching the water flow over smooth stones. "Beatrice, there's something I want to tell you." She turned to him, her expression curious. "Yes? Since meeting you, I've been changing. Healing, I suppose you might call it. You've helped me see beyond the destruction and loss to possibilities I couldn't imagine before." Beatrice's cheeks flushed slightly. "I've done very little, Asher. The strength was in you all along." He shook his head. "No, you've done more than you know. Your faith, your kindness, your—" He hesitated, then plunged ahead. "Your presence in my life has been like a light in darkness." Their eyes met, and Asher saw in hers a reflection of the feelings growing in his own heart. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he reached out and took her hand in his. Her fingers were warm and slender, curling trustingly around his. "Beatrice, I know we haven't known each other long, but I feel as if I've been waiting for you without realizing it." Her breath caught, but she didn't look away. "I feel it too, Asher. From that first day when Father and I brought the supplies, there was something about you that called to my heart." Emboldened by her words, Asher leaned closer. "May I kiss you, Beatrice Novak?" Her answer was to close the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was gentle yet filled with promise. It was brief, proper, but it sent a current of joy through Asher's body that he hadn't experienced in years, perhaps ever. When they parted, Beatrice's eyes were shining. "I believe God has plans for us, Asher O'Malley, plans for hope and a future." He recognized the reference to Jeremiah, one of his mother's favorite passages. "I'm beginning to believe that too." As the weeks passed, Asher's fence grew longer, encircling more of his property, and with each section completed, more of his scattered herd was recovered and brought safely home. By early summer, he had nearly 40 head of cattle grazing in his enclosed pastures, not the 100 he'd once had, but enough to build upon. He visited Wilson frequently, both for supplies and to see Beatrice. Their courtship progressed steadily, with Sunday dinners at the ranch becoming a tradition and occasional picnics by the creek when Beatrice could leave the store in the capable hands of her assistant, a young widow named Mrs. Collins. Henry watched their growing relationship with approving eyes, often finding reasons to doze off or become engrossed in a book when they might want privacy. The old man's health was declining gradually, his breathing more labored and his energy diminishing, but his spirit remained bright, especially when he spoke of the future. "You two remind me of Sarah and me when we were young," he told them one Sunday evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "The way you look at each other, even when you think no one notices." Beatrice blushed, but didn't contradict her father. Instead, she reached for Asher's hand, their fingers intertwining comfortably. That night, after driving them back to town, Asher walked Beatrice to the door of their rooms above the mercantile. Henry had already gone inside, giving them a moment alone. "Beatrice," Asher began, his heart pounding in his chest, "I've been thinking a lot about the future, our future." She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the stars overhead. "So have I." He took both her hands in his. "I love you. I think I've loved you since that first day when you showed up at my ranch with supplies and hope. You've brought light back into my life and faith back into my heart." Tears glistened in her eyes. "Oh, Asher, I love you too." Drawing a deep breath, he continued, "I know I don't have much to offer right now. The ranch is still rebuilding, and it will be years before it's what it once was. But if you're willing to build that future with me, to share in the work and the rewards, I would be the happiest man in Colorado." A smile broke across her face like sunshine. "Are you asking me to marry you, Asher O'Malley?" "I am," he confirmed, dropping to one knee on the wooden walkway outside the store. "Beatrice Novak, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, with all my heart." He rose and pulled her into his arms, their kiss sealing the promise between them. When they parted, Beatrice's eyes were shining with joy. "Father will be so pleased," she said. "He's been hoping for this since our first dinner together at the hotel." Asher laughed softly. "Is that why he always seems to find a reason to leave us alone?" "I suspect so. He's not as subtle as he thinks." The news of their engagement spread quickly through Wilson, met with universal approval and congratulations. The townspeople had watched their courtship with interest and satisfaction, many feeling that they had played a small part in bringing the couple together through their support after the fire. They set the wedding date for September, when the weather would still be mild and the heavy work of summer would be winding down. It would be a simple ceremony in the town's newly constructed church, followed by a celebration in the town square, much like the spring social where they had first danced together. As the wedding day approached, Asher worked feverishly to complete projects at the ranch, finishing the fence around his entire property, beginning construction on the new barn with the help of neighbors, and preparing the homestead house for his bride. Beatrice, meanwhile, trained Mrs. Collins to manage more aspects of the mercantile and spent evenings sewing her wedding dress with the help of the town's women. Henry's health continued to decline, but he insisted that nothing would prevent him from walking his daughter down the aisle. "The good Lord won't take me until I've seen you properly married," he declared with stubborn certainty. The day before the wedding, Asher made a final visit to town as a single man. After collecting the last items needed for the celebration, he stopped by the mercantile to see Beatrice. "It's bad luck to see the bride before the wedding," Mrs. Collins admonished when he entered, but her stern expression was belied by the twinkle in her eyes. "Just for a moment," he pleaded, and the woman relented, calling Beatrice from the back room. When she appeared, Asher felt the same rush of joy he experienced every time he saw her. "I just wanted to tell you that everything is ready at the ranch," he said, keeping a respectable distance under Mrs. Collins's watchful eye. "The house, the new bedroom furniture, everything." Beatrice smiled, her eyes alight with anticipation. "And I'm ready too. Mrs. Jenkins finished the last stitches on my dress this morning, and Father's in high spirits despite his cough." They stood looking at each other, both thinking of the life they would begin together the next day. "Until tomorrow, then," Asher said softly. "Until tomorrow," Beatrice echoed, "when I become Mrs. O'Malley." The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, as if nature itself approved of the union. The church, though simple, had been decorated with wildflowers and ribbons by the women of Wilson. Asher stood at the altar, wearing his father's best suit, refitted for his taller frame, his heart pounding with nervous excitement. When the door opened and Beatrice appeared on her father's arm, a collective murmur of appreciation rose from the assembled guests. Her dress was simple but elegant ivory silk with lace at the collar and cuffs, her auburn hair crowned with a wreath of white flowers. But it was her radiant expression that truly captivated Asher. In that moment, he knew with absolute certainty that this woman was God's greatest gift to him. Henry, though pale and moving slowly, walked proudly beside his daughter. When they reached the altar, he placed Beatrice's hand in Asher's, his own trembling slightly with emotion and weakness. "Take care of my girl," he whispered. "With my life," Asher promised. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, the couple exchanging vows they had written themselves. Beatrice spoke of finding in Asher a partner for all seasons, a man whose strength and determination matched his gentleness and capacity for love. Asher, his voice thick with emotion, promised to build with her a life founded on faith, respect, and unwavering devotion. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the cheers and applause from the congregation nearly lifted the roof of the small church. Outside, as they emerged into the autumn sunshine, they were showered with flower petals and well wishes. The celebration in the town square lasted well into the evening, with music, dancing, and enough food to feed the entire county. Asher and Beatrice moved among their guests, accepting congratulations and sharing their joy. Henry sat in a place of honor, receiving visitors with dignity despite his obvious fatigue. As twilight descended and lanterns were lit around the square, Asher found a moment alone with his new wife. "Are you happy, Mrs. O'Malley?" he asked, drawing her close. Beatrice looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the lantern light. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible." "Then my fence building was worth it, for it led me to you." She laughed softly. "And my faith building was worth it, for it led you back to God." They shared a tender kiss as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, a promise of the life they would build together on the foundation of love, faith, and resilience. As winter approached, Asher and Beatrice settled into the rhythm of their new life together. The ranch flourished under their combined efforts, Asher's knowledge of cattle and land management complemented by Beatrice's sharp business sense and organizational skills. Mrs. Collins continued to manage the day-to-day operations of the mercantile, with Beatrice overseeing the accounts and ordering. Henry's health worsened with the cold weather, and by Christmas, it was clear that he would not see another spring. He moved into the ranch house with them, occupying the small bedroom that had once been Asher's as a boy. There, surrounded by the love of his daughter and son-in-law, he passed his final days in peace. "God knew what he was doing," Henry told Asher one evening as they sat by the fire while Beatrice prepared dinner. "When he brought you two together, you needed each other." Asher nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "You're right about that. I was lost before Beatrice came into my life. And she needed someone to love who would love her completely in return. Her mother's death left a hole in her heart that only the right kind of love could fill." The old man coughed weakly, then continued. "Promise me you'll always remember that faith brought you together. When times get hard, and they will, son, that's the way of life. Hold on to that faith." "I promise," Asher said solemnly, clasping the older man's frail hand in his own strong one. Henry passed peacefully in his sleep 3 days after Christmas. The entire town turned out for his funeral, a testament to the respect and affection he had earned in his short time in Wilson. Beatrice grieved deeply, but found comfort in Asher's steady presence and the faith her father had nurtured in her. As winter gave way to spring, new life flourished on the O'Malley ranch. The cattle herd increased with the birth of calves, the new barn stood complete and sturdy against the occasional spring storms, and the fence, that first project of Asher's rebuilding, encircled their property completely, a symbol of protection and perseverance. But the most joyous news came on a warm evening in May, as Asher and Beatrice sat on the porch watching the sunset, a habit they had maintained since their marriage. "Asher," Beatrice said, her voice soft with wonder, "I have something to tell you." He turned to her, noting the special glow in her eyes. "What is it, love?" She took his hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "We're going to have a baby." Joy, pure and overwhelming, surged through Asher's heart. He gathered Beatrice into his arms, holding her as if she were made of the most precious material on earth. "A baby," he whispered, tears blurring his vision. "Our child." "Father always said children were God's way of saying the world should go on," Beatrice murmured against his shoulder. "That life is stronger than death, and love more powerful than loss." Asher thought of all they had overcome, his grief and loss of faith, the destruction of the fire, Henry's passing, and how each challenge had ultimately led to greater blessings. The fence he had built to contain his herd had become a symbol of much more, the boundaries of a life rebuilt on solid foundations, a protected space where love and faith could flourish. "Your father was a wise man," he said, pressing a kiss to Beatrice's forehead. "And I believe he's looking down right now, proud of the family we're building." They remained on the porch until the stars emerged, bright and countless in the clear Colorado sky. The future stretched before them, full of promise and possibility, built on the strong foundations of faith, love, and resilience. In November, as the first snow dusted the mountains in the distance, James Henry O'Malley came into the world. A strong, healthy boy with his mother's auburn hair and his father's determined chin. Asher held his son with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the miracle of new life and the responsibility it represented. "He's perfect," Beatrice said from the bed, tired but radiant after the long labor. "Just like his mother," Asher replied, carefully placing the swaddled infant in her arms. As he watched them together, his wife and son, he felt a profound sense of gratitude that defied words. Later that evening, after the midwife had left and young James slept peacefully in the cradle Asher had crafted, husband and wife stood at the window watching snowflakes drift down in the moonlight. "I was thinking," Asher said, his arm around Beatrice's waist, "about that first day you came to the ranch with the supplies and your father." She leaned against him, content despite her exhaustion. "What about it?" "You said then that you believed God puts people in our paths when we need them most. You were right. He put you in my path when I needed faith and hope. He put me in yours when you needed someone to build a life with." Beatrice smiled, turning to face him. "And now he's given us James to love and raise together." Asher kissed her gently, then rested his forehead against hers. "I built a fence strong enough for my herd," he whispered, "but you, Beatrice O'Malley, you built my faith even stronger." Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the land in a blanket of white, while inside, the warmth of love and new life filled the home that had once stood empty and cold. The fence that surrounded their property gleamed silver in the moonlight, a testament to resilience and the promise of renewal. Within its boundaries, a family had been born, founded on love that had transformed loss into blessing and doubt into faith, a love strong enough to weather any storm and build a future filled with hope.